Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode, we bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. The conditions during March have been very difficult and has thrown up many challenges for farmers, some of which we're going to discuss in this episode. I'm delighted to be joined by Head of Sheep in Teagasc, Michael Gottstein, to discuss this in a bit more detail and offer some advice on how to manage during this period for those at different stages. For those lambed in early March, those currently lambing and those preparing for outdoor lambing. We discussed various aspects of management from grazing to nutrition and hygiene and highlight some of the disease risks during this period with Michael offering some very useful tips and advice on each of them. We start off with Michael discussing the challenges that the weather in March has presented.
We had a great February. I suppose people were delighted with the weather in February, very dry. Generally when we get long dry spells, they're followed by long wet spells, and we certainly got that in March. And I suppose it's very, very difficult for people that were lambing. People that are lambing indoors need to get lambs out quick enough. And I suppose it came right bang at the start of lambing for most people that were kind of lambing in, middle of March. We had quite difficult conditions, even a little bit of snow there in early March, the first week of March in certain places. So I suppose it's been a challenging spring, I suppose, for people.
I think, Michael, it's fair to say anyone would have swapped February weather for March weather. Look, if we might get into the challenges, and I suppose just maybe frame this a little bit, we have those that are lambed and are outdoors now maybe 2 to 3 weeks, those are on the pint of lambing, or those maybe with some sheep indoors. We'll try and cover the 3 different aspects. So if we start with those that are outdoors at the moment, maybe lamb from the start of March onwards, the couple of challenges they face, like look at the utilisation, dirty fields, heavy fields, wet fields, that aren't ideal for grazing. Now, I put in the caveat that there is huge variation out there, but some are really struggling at the moment with grazing conditions. Yeah. Look at,
I suppose we're recording this today on the 28th of March, and I'm conscious that, we got a good bit of rain last night and even later yesterday, and ground is very, very wet. But prior to that, it kind of dried very, very quickly because we had great drying weather the previous 2 days. So ground conditions are obviously very variable. It depends on ground type. I suppose the thing with sheep is they don't so much poach like we'd see in cattle or cutting, but they certainly puddy and dirty the grass, and utilization is very, very difficult. So if the grass gets dirty, if there's surface water, or a lot of water on top of the ground, then the grass is going to get dirty, in particular around gaps and feeders and drinkers and things like that. But also throughout the fields, so as the sheep are in there for a period of time, they'll dirty it. And obviously there are challenges then. There are challenges from a health point of view, because you have a lot of muck and feces and gutter around the place, and that contaminates the feed and everything. So we have challenges in terms of possible infections. In lambs, in young lambs, maybe things like joint ill, or in ewes, mastitis, or things like that. From a nutritional point of view, I suppose we have the challenge of trying to get the feed into the ewe so that she can milk. And I suppose if the grass is dirty, they're less inclined to eat it. If the grass is wet, it generally reduces intake. Some of the work from UCD, Tommy Boland would have shown there that wet grass reduces intake by about 20%. So that's a challenge for the ewe, because she's already nutritionally challenged, because her milk yield is increasing, and her intake hasn't caught up with it yet, particularly in the first kind of 3 or 4 weeks after lambing. So, and then we have challenges like driving rain and wind, and just uncomfortable weather as well for animals to graze in, where they're maybe stuck under a ditch sheltering rather than being out in the field grazing. So all of those things, all of those things together make for challenging grazing conditions.
Let's parse that out slightly. I covered a number of aspects. We'll deal with maybe the dirty pasture one first, Michael. There's no simple solution of maybe bar moving them off, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So look at, if the grass is dirty, as in soil or muck along there, it's highly unlikely sheep are going to eat that, and if you force them in there, you're going to reduce your intake. You're going to get an awful lot of soil intake going in with them, which is going to have implications for other things. And maybe the solution is to move them off it. into the next grazing area. That's obviously where people have other areas to graze. Allow the rain to clean off the grass and come back, 5 or 6 or 7 days later when it's cleaned up or maybe dried up a little bit, hopefully, and keep switching over and back to try and prevent it from, getting really mucky and dirty and the grass really coated with soil that, is going to prevent them from eating it.
So this is one of them times you have to be flexible. It's not the ideal scenario, but you just make do. As you said before, they only paddle it, so it will clean up in a week or 10 days' time. You can come back in again and clean it out at that point. Look, in terms of supply, where there's adequate supply, that situation works. Where there's not, Michael, it's one time where they might have to go in with extra feed to carry them through this period.
Yeah, first 5 weeks is when the ewes are reaching their peak milk yield. Somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks into lactation, ewes hit their peak milk yield, and that sets the milk yield, the overall milk yield for the lactation. So if you restrict ewes in the first 5 weeks, you generally have impacted on your lamb performance for the entire period up to weaning. So we want to try and feed the ewes as well as we can, and I mean, we would be advocating there that people would have adequate grass and all of that kind of thing, like, closing your grass in time in the autumn, having an autumn closing plan, or having a plan as to how you're going to graze in the spring. Make sure that we have, adequate grass supply, that the ewes are grazing kind of going in at 6-7 centimeters and grazing down to, 4 centimeters or maybe a little bit tighter. And that works fine in a normal year with normal weather. We haven't had a normal year, normal weather, so I suppose it's a bit more challenging. So we need to make sure that if we don't have that type of grass, there are probably farms out there, very dry ground with good grass supplies, that are getting away on grass only. If you're lucky to be that type of a farmer, that's great. If you're not in that situation, then maybe we need to look at supplementing and again, look at, I suppose most farmers would be supplementing for magnesium, so putting out maybe mineral buckets, but a lot of farmers would probably have to consider concentrate feed as well. The amount again will depend on grass supply and grazing conditions, somewhere between probably 0.5 kilo a day and up to, in situations where there's no grass, maybe 1.5 kilos of concentrates, in the extreme cases. I don't actually think, to be honest with you, that it has been a bad growth year. So I think a lot of farmers probably have reasonable grass supplies. I suppose the challenge is poor utilization and poor grazing conditions.
You touched on one other one there, and you mentioned it previously, like where sheep where grazing is limited, either on intake or the amount of time they spend grazing is limited. Tetany is a risk, Michael, at this time as well.
Yeah, so look, at grass tetany is always a risk in the springtime with ewes and lactating ewes, and generally with sheep. Unfortunately, when tetany strikes, it's usually a dead sheep we find, and they can be hard enough to save. Like grass tetany prevention protocols are important in sheep in every year. I suppose what happens when we see this type of weather conditions, because everything is so wet, there's a lot of soil contamination and all of that, the ewe's ability to absorb magnesium, which is the mineral that she needs to prevent grass tetany, is reduced by about half or even a third to a third of what it would normally be. So it's very, very important that we supplement with adequate magnesium in a way that we can get it into the ewe. So like the best way of doing that is with concentrate feed, but obviously that's very expensive. So if we don't have to do that, then it's probably a mineralic, a high mag mineralic for sheep. So very important that it's not a cattle mineral high mag bucket we're using. It has to be one that's suitable for sheep. Now there are buckets out there that are both suitable for cattle and sheep, and that's fine. They're fine. But the cattle buckets on their own generally tend to have very high levels of copper, so we want to avoid those for sheep. So I'd be advocating here in 2 buckets per grazing group, kind of a third of the way into the field and 2/3 of the way that the ewes are frequently passing it. Hopefully they'll lick it and get their intake into them.
So plenty of access to it. I suppose, Michael, too, keeping them buckets moved and checking that they don't actually get dirty themselves is important as well to improve intake.
Yeah, so in really wet weather, what you will see is that, there will be dirt, like, because, you will put her foot into it, or, some you will defecate into it or whatever. So it's just to clean them out, tip them out. In wet weather, intakes tend to be quite good, and that's simply because they're kind of drinking the liquid, the rain that's kind of mixing with the molasses and stuff like that. So we tend to get very good intakes with buckets in wet weather. It's in drier weather, I suppose, it can be a little bit more challenging sometimes. Moving everything is very important, Kieran. So, very, very quickly, if you're feeding meal in trucks, or have mineral buckets out, or even people who might be creep feeding lambs, the feeders it'll get very messy around the feeders very, very quickly. And, that muck is carried around from the feeders then to the grass. It's carried into the feeders, and lambs tend to consume it. That's ideal type of conditions for spreading diseases like coccidiosis in young lambs. Again, all that muck gets stuck on the udder of the ewe, creates challenges in terms of mastitis and, potential mastitis infections. And mastitis is probably one of the big things that we see in years like this here, in, a number of different types of mastitis. So you have your kind of infectious, staph type mastitis, which is basically, dirt getting in and infection happening there. You also get the kind of E. coli type. Again, look, it's an infectious mastitis, but it's very often a sign of stress, in the animals. So the animals are under stress, and their immunity is somewhat waned. And when we see E. coli mastitis, you always get very, very sick with that. Very easy to spot. And also mastitis caused by sores, so oversuckling. That the ewe isn't milking very well because conditions are poor, or nutrition might be up to scratch, and there's a lamb there that's continuously trying to suckle and eventually damages the teat, and gets sore, and then the ewe will stop the lamb from sucking, and then bacteria infection gets into the udder, and we end up with a ewe with mastitis and a lamb that's very hungry in the field. So this is a time really here where people need to be very vigilant and start picking up those cases very quick. Like, the quicker you can intervene there, the quicker you can intervene there, Kieran, the better. In terms of identifying a ewe that has mastitis, treating her. A lot of times with mastitis, we're trying to treat the ewe to keep her alive. Taking in the lamb, either artificially ring that lamb, or the odd case, I suppose, with the sore teats from oversuckling. We can probably milk out the ewe before she gets mastitis and treat the sores and try and get her back up and running for the lamb to get going again.
Yes, definitely one maybe for a problem group to be kept back later on. Look, it's just at a real wrong time for early March-born lambs. You're hitting that peak demand and peak yield. Michael, for some maybe with slightly younger lambs, they're looking at bringing them indoors at night. Some of the real torrential wet nights that we're getting, maybe conditions in the field are very poor, waterlogged. Is there any challenges around that?
Yeah, so I suppose if we're bringing in lambs at night and look at it, I suppose there would be lots of people would be used to doing that maybe earlier on. Generally, maybe January lambing, would leave ewes out by day and in by night. A lot of pedigree breeders would be doing that initially with ewes and lambs. So, it's just about having adequate space inside the shed. Obviously need to bring them in daylight hours, make sure that they all come in, that there's not lambs and ewes left scattered around the field. A big area, we're probably talking about 2+ square meters per ewe, 2.5 square meters per ewe. No kind of corners or jagged areas or poles sticking out in the pen that aren't protected with either tires or something like that. Because ewes will puck lambs that are coming up to them if they're not theirs, and can easily injure and kill lambs. If there is protrusions like in the pen, corners and things like that. So they need to be kind of fenced off. It gives them a good break, in particular in very continuous adverse weather. So if you have a day where it's absolutely bucketing all day and it's going to keep bucketing all night long, getting the lambs in out of that, giving them a couple of hours respite before they have to face into the end the following day, is great for them. A dry lie, but obviously there are costs associated with that. And with yours recently lambed, I think you'd be supplying concentrate feed, and you'd be supplying fodder and obviously straw. So those are all not cheap. And there's a cost there, but I suppose it needs to be weighed up in terms of the animal welfare, improved performance from the lambs. It obviously gives them a great break when the weather conditions are very bad.
Is the potential challenges, Michael, with mismothering, particularly just in that environment, if you have a lot of young lambs brought in together?
Yeah, so look at, I suppose it's a function, Kieran, of how well they're mothered before they go out. And I think this year probably a lot of lambs are very well mothered, gone out into the field because they were held back. There was probably very few farmers that will have basically, left ewes and lambs out at kind of 24 hours or this March gone by, because just we didn't seem to have any days really up until recently. There are a couple of days where that could have happened. So look, at by and large, I think they should be fine. I think most people will not have put them into big huge batches yet, 300 and 400 ewes coming in with lambs, I suppose, is highly unlikely. They'll probably still be in smaller groups around. And they should be fine in terms of mothering up. Look, at the other thing, I suppose, is most people should be and are and I think should be numbering lambs and numbering ewes, and it's easy enough to figure out if something was wrong. If you can find, if you've got a lamb number 75 running around with no mom, find number 75, and hopefully you've used a different color for the twins and the singles, so that there should be one or two lambs with that ewe, and put her back in if needs be. And look, we're going to have to do that, I think, this spring, Kieran. People are going to have, like you said, a kind of maybe a hospital paddock, or certainly a couple of pens inside in the shed that are probably going to be brought back into use again, dealing with some of these ewes that got mastitis or mismothering outside or things like that because of the bad weather.
Just, Michael, maybe when we're inside, we'll just touch on the later lambers, maybe ewe lambs or lamb later at the tail end of the ewes for turnout. I suppose the two challenges with them is, one, if the conditions don't improve, it's difficult to get turnout, and also probably the fields that we used at the start of March for turnout are either bare now or certainly well paddled. That does throw up a bit of a challenge. The flip side of that is there's only so long you can keep them in for as well without maybe incurring some problems or putting in significant feed.
Yeah, and I think one of the things in previous years or in past years, I suppose, Kieran, what's happened? We've often had adverse weather conditions, maybe not for as long as we've had it this spring. And what we generally find is, in particular, where that poor weather comes towards the end of lambing, it can be very challenging from a disease point of view in the shed, because the disease builds up as lambing progresses. This year, I suppose, we were lucky enough insofar as that the bad weather kind of came at the start, and when people were holding in lambs, there was very low disease levels inside the shed because we hadn't any lambs yet. It was there from kind of the start of it, of the process. The challenge now, I suppose, is that a lot of sheds will have had lambs in them and ewes and lambs in them for the last 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, and as these ewe lambs and later lambing ewes start coming, the disease pressure is building up in the sheds as well. Farmers are getting tired as well. People have maybe had a very busy lambing period, and the body is getting that little bit more tired, and maybe things aren't done as well as they could be. So the challenge there is going to be really from a disease point of view. Things like watery mouth joint ill, joint and navel ill, things like E. coli mastitis in the ewes, those type of things. So trying to prevent that. So lots of straw, lots of lime, lots of attention to detail, hygiene when we're handling the sheep, clean clothes, clean gloves, and then lots of straw if we have to hold them in for periods of time. Lots of straw. Straw is king there in terms of keeping things clean and reducing the infection pressure. But and it costs money, and I suppose that's another side of the challenge. And in terms of holding them ewes in, they need to be fed significantly more than they would have been fed pre-lambing. So the ewes' energy and protein requirements kind of double from when they're not pregnant to late pregnancy, and they double again from late pregnancy to early lactation. So if you were feeding 0.7 or 0.8 of a kilo of meal on a reasonably good quality silage, then you probably need to be going to twice that after lambing. Obviously build them up slowly if they were being kept inside. If we want them to milk to their full potential. So that's the thing to remember. I suppose the thing is, if we can get them out to grass, it's much cheaper. Hopefully with the weather improving, if the weather improves, it'll be cleaner. We won't have the same infection challenge. The nutrition is better, provided that there's good quality grass there and enough of it. The other thing, I suppose, is this idea of grazing younger lambs behind ground on the same ground where older lambs have grazed before, and that's very challenging for those younger lambs from a coccidiosis point of view. So we generally do not advocate grazing a younger bunch of lambs behind an older bunch of lambs. So where at all possible, people should try and, for the ewe lambs, rearing lambs, or those later ewes, lambing down, maybe have an area that hasn't been grazed this spring by ewes and lambs for grazing those until they've kind of developed immunity to coccidia, which is generally kind of 8 to 10 weeks of age, So that's best practice. Where that's not possible, obviously, then we need to just be very vigilant and go in with a coccidiostat if those lambs do get an infection.
Okay, so just a few things we mindful. So again, double down on your nutrition. If you need extra straw, it's an investment that's worth making for those that hold it in. Let's just take it to the other end of it. We're starting to see more outdoor lambing flocks kicking off. The hill flocks be starting. Obviously, a lot of this is weather dependent. Is there anything that they can do to try and safeguard in some way some of the challenges we face in this weather?
Yeah, challenging times. If the weather doesn't improve, a lot of the hill flocks are probably kicking off. 7th to 10th of April kind of seems to be a date that I hear an awful lot down south where I am, Kieran, anyway. And, so that's about a week away at this stage, maybe a little bit with it, maybe 2 weeks in some cases. And I suppose for those ewes, for those farmers at this stage, it's about the ewes and nutrition of the ewes. So make sure that they have plenty of suck for the lambs when they lamb down, to try and reduce body conditions loss. And I suppose the ship has probably sailed for most people on that one at this stage, because they're not going to change body condition score now in the last couple of weeks before lambing. But things that farmers can do and would be very important would be, again, look at the whole area of cleanliness of the ewes in the run up to lambing. Okay, so it's all well and good putting the ewe into a clean pen after lambing with lots of straw, but if she's covered in muck and feces from a feeder that was kind of outside in an area that was very, very dirty around it, then that dirt is going to be there, and that's what the lamb is going to come in contact with. So moving feeders, and I know that that sounds very easy in practice, and it's not much more difficult to do it in practice. It sounds easy in theory to move the feeders, but it's much more difficult in practice. But try and reduce the level of muckiness around feeders by moving them frequently. And that would be important, I suppose. Then when the ewes are getting ready to lamb down, to try and have a relatively clean area for them to lamb down in, and certainly after they lamb, an area if they're pure outdoor lambing and don't have an area to bring ewes into as they're lambing, then try and have clean paddocks that you're moving, or clean fields that you're moving ewes with lambs into as soon as is practical. For those farmers who do bring them in, and quite a few heel sheep farmers might bring in the couples, maybe leave the singles outside, or would have some limited facilities maybe to house a few sheep, then I suppose it's picking the most vulnerable sheep, the sheep that will benefit most from the housing. Okay, so they generally would be your ewes with multiples, ewes with smaller, weaker lambs, maybe younger ewes. Ewes in poor body condition. So we know that, Kieran, the ability of ewes to mother lambs, the mothering ability, is governed by the body condition of the ewe. So ewes that are in poor body condition are poor mothers, tend to spend less time attending to their lambs, but also age is another big factor there. So younger ewes are generally spend less time mothering their lambs than older ewes. So if people keep that in mind, and obviously then bigger litters, you will obviously lick one much more thoroughly than she will lick 2 lambs, because she has to spend twice the amount of time licking the 2 lambs to get the same effect. So the critical ones there, I suppose, are young ewes, thin ewes, and multiple litters. And then I suppose the other thing, Kieran, the challenge that we have indoors is generally from an infection point of view. The challenge that we have outdoors is generally from a kind of a weather, hypothermia, starvation, predation point of view. So it's a switch. We don't have the same infection challenge outside, but we have a different challenge, and that challenge is hypothermia, starvation. Lambs that don't get a good suck have very little chance outside, because they're not inside a warm, dry environment.
Topic we covered there a few weeks ago, which is again very important, and hopefully it's only going to be in a short period, this weather spell. Look, Michael, all we can do is keep fingers crossed the conditions improve and hopefully it gets off to a better April.
Yeah, look at it is, and I think it's probably very important, Kieran, just to maybe flag people back to that one podcast we did on the dealing with hypothermia and starvation in lambs. And all farmers that are lambing outside should have a store of glucose available, that when they go out in the morning or at any time in the day and find a lamb that is hypothermic, that they have a glucose to give, an injection to give into the belly of the lamb to save it. And that works very well. So people that haven't started lambing yet, get down to your local co-op shop or supermarket or health food store and get a little tub of glucose. It's cheap as chips, and have a listen to our podcast or look at a few videos there on YouTube as to how to do that glucose injection in young lamb. And it's very simple to do, and it'll save an awful lot of lambs if the weather doesn't clear up for us for the outdoor lambing flocks. And hopefully the weather will clear up and it'll be much better for those people. But just in the case that it doesn't, it would be very useful for people to have that information and that the equipment required to hand to be able to save those lambs.
Definitely a vital thing. Look, Michael, it's good having you on. Fingers crossed we get a better couple of weeks ahead. Thanks again.
Thanks, Kieran.
Okay, we'll leave it there for this episode. It's one of them times a year we have to be flexible and adapt to management. Again, for those indoors, doubling down on hygiene, getting the nutrition right both indoors and outdoors is key to getting through this period. Hopefully we've seen improvement over the coming weeks. We mentioned episode on hypothermia, that's episode 169. You'll find it in the playlist for this podcast. Very useful for anyone that has lambs in them kind of conditions. That's it for me. For updates from our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and tune in to future episodes of OviCast.